Hi, everyone. My name is Katherine Kowalczyk, and welcome to another episode of the Responsibility Quotient podcast. It is June the 18th, 2024, and today I have as my guest author and Western Standard columnist Michael Wagner. I had the pleasure of meeting Michael Wagner a few years ago during the COVID lockdown era where we're all grappling for answers or trying to find answers and solutions to what I think shocked many people, and that was the government tyranny, the mandates, and the lockdowns that for my entire life, and I'm going to be turning 49 years old next week, was never really an issue from my perspective. But the government tyranny, I think, hit all of us. And I was lucky enough to be introduced to a group of people now known as the Alberta Prosperity Project. And it was through the Alberta Prosperity Project, but also during my time as a member and interim leader and party candidate with the Independence Party, that I was able to learn more about Michael Wagner and his story and why he supports Alberta independence. I have come to also support Alberta independence. And a lot of what I think you'll hear tonight from Michael will not only inform you, but I think will convince you that Alberta has had quite the raw deal in Confederation in Canada for quite some time, since we've joined, in fact, and that I don't like the word separatist because I think that it's so harsh. I much prefer independence. But my view is that in addition to all the reasons that you're going to hear this evening from Michael Wagner, I think that really the only solution right now to get out from under the thumb of this tyranny that is being imposed by mostly our Canadian government, but also our provincial government as well, is to leave Canada. And that's mostly, I feel right now, because of Canada's globalist ties to the World Economic Forum, the UN, and the World Health Organization. I do believe that so long as Canada remains apart and the provincial government of Alberta continues to endorse and promote globalist policies, that we as Albertans are going to continue to suffer the tyranny and the not so slow slide into communism, which is where I think we're at right now, actually. So a little bit about Michael Wagner. As I mentioned, he is a columnist with the Western Standard um, news outlet. He's an independent researcher and writer, and he's written many books, but three in particular have been about independence. The first one is Alberta, Separatism Then and Now. The second is No Other Option, Self-Determination for Alberta. And I'm excited that we're going to be able to talk about his third book in particular tonight, Time to Leave, Canada Cannot Be Fixed. It's brand new and it's available on Amazon Kindle right now, and it will be available in hard copy soon. So Michael Wagner, thank you for joining me today and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, so you live with your wife, Ivy, and your 11 children in Alberta, and you're homeschooling them, or you were homeschooling them, because I know that some have already graduated high school. Is that correct?
Yeah, like there's only four at home with us now, and one actually lives in the United States, but the rest of them are in the Edmonton area.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah. So I remember years ago, it feels like only yesterday, really, but years ago when we met, I think the first time I really had an opportunity to listen to you was at an AGM at the Independence Party of Alberta in, I think, 2022. You were a keynote speaker there. And, I'd been just new to this whole idea of independence. I wasn't a separatist, and I had really not turned my mind to why Alberta, why I as a Canadian citizen would want to leave Confederation, until really I was introduced to APP and then yourself. And I've read all of your books, and I've read Time to Leave as well. And thank you for giving me an earlier copy of it so I could review it for you. I found it to be very insightful for sure. So I'd like to maybe start off today by giving the audience a little bit of a background as to how you got to the point of thinking that the solution for Alberta was to leave Canada.
Yeah, well, it actually goes back quite a ways. Like the first major, uproar of Alberta independence sentiment was in the early 1980s, especially because of the national energy program of Pierre Trudeau. And I was just a teenager at that time, and I had been kind of interested in, intellectual or international politics a little bit by that time, and not interested in domestic politics. But there was something about the national energy program, like the uproar in Calgary. I was living in Calgary. That's where I was going to school and everything. There was a huge uproar, and somehow it really drew me in. That I really felt that Alberta was under attack from the federal government, and so I joined my first political organization, which was WestFed, and then that organization kind of folded, and it recommended its members to join the Western Canada Concept Party of Alberta, which early in 1982 had won a by-election in the Old Didsbury by-election. It was the first time a separatist candidate had ever won an election in Western Canada. So it was a very exciting time, politically, and it just drew me in. Like I just really loved Alberta, and I felt we were under attack. So I wasn't active, very active. I was quite young. I was just a teenager, so I was very naive about everything. But I wanted to be a part of the action as much as I could. I attended some meetings.
Well, just to stop you there for a second, what about why did you think we were under attack? What was going on then that led you to believe that Alberta was under attack?
Yeah, I didn't give enough background to that. Well, if we go back to the 1970s, of course, Alberta, had a lot of oil. We discovered oil in 1947. That was the major Leduc discovery. But and that was very helpful for Alberta. But for many years afterwards, the price of oil was very low until 1973. And there was a war in the Middle East in 1973, and the price of oil skyrocketed. So Alberta was now going to be able to cash in because under Canada's constitution, resources are provincial. Are under provincial jurisdiction. And so Alberta was going to be able to get a lot of money from its oil because of this sudden increase in the price. But Pierre Trudeau was prime minister, and his base of support was in central Canada, and central Canada did not want to pay the world price of oil. And so even though the price went up dramatically, the Pierre Trudeau instituted a Canadian price much lower than the world price. So when Alberta's oil was sold within Canada, we'd get much less money than we were supposed to get for each barrel. And also Alberta was already exporting oil to the United States, and Pierre Trudeau did something very unique as well. He put an export tax on oil. It was the first time there'd been an export tax on a provincial resource. So the federal government would then take the difference. You had a Canadian price of oil, which was low, and then the world price was much higher. So when we sold the oil at the world price to the United States, the federal government would take the difference between the Canadian price and the federal and the world price. So Alberta was getting gouged, whether we sold our money or sold our oil within Canada or exported it. We were getting gouged, and the federal government was taking a huge amount of money that it really shouldn't have been taking, so that it could subsidize, the oil and the energy in central Canada. So throughout the 1970s, Peter Lougheed, our premier, was fighting with Pierre Trudeau over the oil pricing, and Alberta was losing for the most part. We were losing money every year, like billions of dollars a year. Then in 1979, there was a federal election, and Joe Clark's Progressive Conservatives won a minority government. Because it was a minority government, it was unstable, and they were only in power for a few months. They were supposed to do better for Alberta, but they weren't really able to accomplish anything. So in Parliament, they proposed a budget which was defeated in Parliament in the House of Commons. So there had to be a new federal election for February 1980. And so Pierre Trudeau kind of made his comeback then. And the Liberal campaign during 1980 was very much, a regionally divisive campaign. It was like, vote for us and we'll put Alberta in its place. That's kind of I'm summarizing, but that's essentially what the Liberal campaign was. And, the Central Canadian voters knew that if Pierre Trudeau was reelected, they would get much lower energy prices because they'd be getting, subsidized by Alberta. And so Pierre Trudeau won a majority government on that basis. And within a few months later, he instituted what's called the National Energy Program, which was, kind of the worst energy program any energy policy Canada ever had. And it was very much the federal government, I'm summarizing, but taking control of Alberta's resources, taking more of the money that belonged to us. And so because of how terrible that policy was, a lot of oil companies started, shipping their oil rigs to the United States because they couldn't make money, with the federal government taking so much in taxes. And so it really sank Alberta's economy. Like there was thousands of people lost their jobs because of that. And many people lost their homes. There was families that broke up. It was just a horrible time. And sometimes, when I still go to meetings, I'll run into someone who remembers what happened. And like I was a teenager, and my dad was in the food business, so we weren't really affected because everybody has to buy food regardless of how bad the economy is. But there were, you can meet people at some of these meetings who will tell you that their parents lost their homes and lost their jobs and stuff because they remember, like, that was a terrible time in the early 1980s because of the National Energy Program. It got rid of so many jobs and so much economic opportunity. Now, on the heel, shortly after the National Energy Program, like within a couple of years, there was a world recession, which also hurt Alberta. And I just bring that up because sometimes, like I've seen on the CBC likes to blame the recession for the outcome of the National Energy Program. Like the National Energy Program hammered Alberta, and there's a lot of economic studies that say how bad it was for Alberta. But groups like the CBC say, oh, it wasn't the National Energy Program, it was this recession. Well, they both had an impact, but the National Energy Program definitely hurt Alberta, before the recession hit and caused severe damage. Anyway, as that program was released and the impact was, hammering the communities, that's kind of like, it was a big issue of discussion in Calgary where I was. And it somehow, like I said, it didn't really affect me personally in terms of my family life, but it was affecting my community. And I just felt very, passionately that we were under attack because of what Trudeau was doing to Alberta. I mean, it's an unprecedented policy. There was never anything like that before or since. The way Pierre Trudeau attacked Alberta. The closest thing is what Justin Trudeau is doing, but so far, he hasn't caused the economic calamity that his father did. But if he keeps getting his way with the policies, eventually, we'll reach that point. But for now, the National Energy Program is unique in Canadian history for the way a federal government would attack one provincial province, or one province, an industry centered in Alberta. So anyway, that's really what got me worked up and passionate about that, so that I got involved. And so, like I said, I was just a teenager out of 10 meetings and stuff. So that was kind of my initial interest in independence. So I remained a little bit active in the Western Canada concept throughout the 1980s. It ended up, basically dissipating at the end of the 1980s. And part of that actually ties in with the story that, it was later in the 1980s when the Reform Party got started. And the Reform Party deliberately cultivated the idea of people who thought, the West should separate. They wanted to bring those kind of people into their party as a way to, the Reform Party slogan was "The West wants in." It was very much a Western-based, a party that wanted to promote what's best for the West, but to bring the energy of those independence people and bring it into a way, or into a movement that would try and reform Canada for the benefit of the West, rather than getting the West out. It was like I said, the West wants in. So I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but for the most part, the independence movement died off during the time of the Reform Party. And like there were little snippets of things here and there, but it really started to take off again after Justin Trudeau, became prime minister in 2015. That's when things really started ramping up again, and that's why we have organizations and meetings again, at levels that we hadn't seen since the early 80s, because Justin Trudeau, very much has an agenda of hurting Alberta, just like his father did. So it's those were the two people who've done the most to build the independence movement. In fact, I call Pierre Trudeau the father of the Alberta separatist movement. There was no separatist movement before Pierre Trudeau became prime minister. There was sentiment. Occasionally, if you look through Alberta's history, you'll occasionally see someone say something about being independent, but there was no actually organized movement, where they're holding meetings and things like that until Pierre Trudeau became prime minister. So he very much got things going. And I might just add, though, that in 1980, with his re-election in the National Energy Program, there was a permanent change in Alberta's political culture. Before 1980, there'd be surveys done on support for independence in Alberta, and the survey results were always single digit, 4 or 5 or 6 people, 4 or 5 6 percentage points, of people in support. Mm. After 1980, it's always been double digit support. Sometimes, just 15% or something, but more frequently in recent years, often 20% or even at 25% or more. So Pierre Trudeau permanently changed Alberta's political culture in the sense that he made independence, a more viable option for many people here, and it stayed that way after all these decades. So I've kind of go ahead.
No. Good. I mean, I think this background is really good for Albertans and people, all over to recognize that really, from your perspective, what kickstarted the idea of independence to begin with. Now, our Constitution can be changed, and however, we haven't seemed to have too much success. Would you can you summarize for how we're able to actually change our constitution, and what, from your perspective, has been the roadblocks?
Sure,
Would you be able to comment on that?
since 1982, the way to amend Canada's constitution is you have to have the approval of a minimum of 7 provinces representing at least 50% of the population. So theoretically, any 7 provinces with a total population of over 50%, but realistically, the way Canada is structured, that means you have to have at least Quebec or Ontario, because without those 2 provinces, you wouldn't have the 70%. So you have to have 7 provinces, would have to agree. They'd have to pass resolutions, or, in their legislatures, plus the House of Commons has to approve it, and the Senate. I think that's kind of, in a nutshell, that's the process for amending Canada's constitution. In an abstract sense, it sounds kind of reasonable, but it's not going to happen, because, well, what I should say is the kinds of constitutional reforms that would help Alberta aren't going to happen, because right now Ontario and Quebec have the power. And if we were to get, the only way we could get a constitutional change that would benefit us would be for them to, give up some of their power. And I think that there is a good example of this too, and that has to do with Senate reform. Like throughout the 1980s and for several years afterwards, there was a very big campaign for Senate reform, especially the Triple-E Senate. Like that would be a Senate. Like right now in our Canada Senate is not elected; it's appointed by the Prime Minister. It does have some power, but it was originally created to give some regional balance, but it doesn't give any regional balance, because the Western provinces have much less representation in the Senate than the other provinces. So it's not fair that way. So the idea by the 1980s was we'd have a Triple-E Senate. That'd be a Senate where the senators are elected rather than appointed as they are now. And there'd be an equal number from each province, so that the provinces would, have effective representation, and also that the authority was that the senators would have effective power. So that'd be kind of like essentially an American type Senate here in Canada. So we'd have provincial representation in the Senate much more equally than we have it now. So that was something actually that really took off, because to make a long story short, the Alberta government ended up endorsing that. Like there was an Alberta legislative committee that wrote a long report. It's actually online. It's close to 300 pages, but it was in 1985, I think it was. A special committee on the Senate and the Alberta legislature wrote a report advocating for the Triple-E Senate. Then when Don Getty became premier, he officially endorsed their Triple-E Senate proposal. So did the Alberta Progressive Conservative Party that he was leader of. So the Alberta government officially embraced the Triple-E Senate proposal, and Don Getty actually created a committee to travel across Canada to try and convince other provinces of it. And he also, in 1989, he held Canada's first Senate election, where there's an election. Still, technically, the Prime Minister could appoint whoever he wanted to, but the idea with the Senate election was if Albertans chose a particular person, there'd be pressure on the Prime Minister to select the person that the Albertans had chosen democratically. And so that actually worked in 1989. That there was a Reform Party by then, so the Reform Party ran a candidate for Senate, Stan Waters, a former middle general in the Canadian Army. And he won. And even though Brian Mulroney didn't want to appoint him to the Senate, he did, because he was under pressure, from Don Getty and maybe from some of the other premiers. So anyway, we had this kind of momentum for the Triple-E Senate. And then the Reform Party won several seats, like 52 seats in the 1993 federal election. That's like most of Alberta's seats and many seats in BC and Saskatchewan in particular. So, and that was one of their main, the Reform Party really saw the Triple-E Senate concept as a way of reforming the Constitution to bring the West into Canada. Like the West wants in. Their idea was to have Western representation in the national government, so that we wouldn't feel left out, so the federal government wouldn't be making decisions that hurt us, because we'd be part of the decision makers, and so that we'd have better decision making that way at the federal level, and it would be decisions that would benefit all of Canada and not just central Canada or the East. Anyway, it's looked like the Triple-E Senate was on a kind of a bit of a momentum, especially after the Reform Party won so many seats, but then it just kind of died off. And so, Central Canada was not interested in it, but it did get a kind of a second chance, because, Stephen Harper was one of the first Reform Party MPs. To make a long story short, the Reform Party became the Canadian Alliance, and Stephen Harper became leader of the Canadian Alliance. And the Canadian Alliance united with the remnants of the old Progressive Conservative Party of Canada to form the new Conservative Party of Canada in 2003. And then Stephen Harper was elected Prime Minister in 2006, and he still believed in Senate reform as Prime Minister. So he tried as Prime Minister, to do what he could to try and bring out Senate reform in Canada. He introduced I think 3 bills in the Canadian Senate over a period of time, and 5 in the House of Commons, trying to get traction for Senate reform. And these bills would have institute what would be called consultative elections, where the provinces would hold elections like Alberta did, where you'd have some people who would run for the position, and the voters would select who they thought was best, and then that person would be submitted. That person's name would be submitted to the Prime Minister. It would still be up to the Prime Minister to appoint him, because that's what the Constitution says. But at least this was a way of providing democratic participation in the selection of the senators. That was one of the features of Harper's bills, and he also wanted to put term limits on the senators of 9 years. So he was trying to bring out some kind of Senate reform, but it was thwarted. One of the ways it was thwarted was Quebec didn't like those kinds of bills. Quebec didn't want those kinds of changes for the Senate. So the Quebec government made a reference case to the Quebec Court of Appeal, where they asked the Quebec Court of Appeal whether these bills from Stephen Harper are constitutional. And so when that happened, Stephen Harper realized it'd be better for him to launch another reference case to the Supreme Court of Canada to kind of supersede the Quebec decision, where Harper could ask the questions that he wanted asked of the court. So his government launched a reference case to the Supreme Court of Canada on Senate reform, and the Supreme Court of Canada said the only way to have any kind of Senate reform, like along the lines that Stephen Harper was talking about, was to have a constitutional amendment, and everybody knew they weren't going to be able to get a constitutional amendment to change the Senate. So that kind of killed Senate reform. But the point of all this information is that we have tried, to reform the Constitution. Like Westerners have tried, whether it's the Alberta government or the Reform Party or even Stephen Harper as Prime Minister, we have tried to get constitutional reforms that would benefit us so that we could be, a full part of Canada. And it's just not going anywhere. And it's because Central Canada doesn't want those kind of changes. Like, again, the way the Canadian political system is, like Ontario and Quebec have the majority of people in Canada, which means they have the majority of seats in the House of Commons, which means they have the power. Like if any federal party that wins Ontario and Quebec has the power, and they control the country, right? And so any kind of policy that is not favored by Ontario and Quebec will not be able to get through the federal government. And Senate reform or any other constitutional reforms that will benefit Western Canada are not going to get through Central Canada, because that involves Central Canada giving up their power to the West. And why would they do that? You know what I mean? It doesn't make sense that when you have a majority of House of Commons members are from Ontario and Quebec, and their job, right, as an elected member of Parliament's job is to represent the best interests of his people. So, members of Parliament from Ontario are going to advocate for the best interests of Ontario, and members of Parliament from Quebec are going to advocate for the best interests of Quebec. And the best interests of Quebec and Ontario is not to give power to the West. You know what I mean? So it's
so
kind
how
of
did the Quebec referendums impact this whole notion of independence from your perspective?
Yeah, like there's just 2 points I want to make. First of all, a lot of people have said, well, there's no use trying to have an independence referendum. Quebec's done that twice, and look, it didn't get them anything. Well, it did get them a lot. In fact, Quebec has been, at the receiving end of so many, billions and tens, probably hundreds of billions of dollars of equalization payments, over the last few decades. So it's true that, the independence referendums in Quebec were not unsuccessful, but Quebec has got so much power, over the federal government because of the federal government and Ontario's fear of Quebec separating. You know what I mean? Like the fear is there that Quebec might separate. And so the federal government will never, institute a policy that's opposed by Quebecers because they don't want to offend Quebecers. It's just too important to keep them happy. And as I mentioned, with the equalization payments, Quebec is getting lots of that, and no one's going to challenge Quebec's equalization payments. Like none of the federal parties will. Pierre Poilievre will not challenge Quebec's equalization payments because he knows that'll be nothing but trouble for him. So I just throw that in there because so many Albertans are looking towards Pierre Poilievre to save us. But on the one hand, even though Quebec's independence referendums failed, it still gave Quebec lots of leverage within Canada, because of the fear of it. But more importantly, perhaps, is that after the second failed referendum, which was in 1995, which just barely failed, I think by 1% or something, the federal government launched a reference case at the Supreme Court, asking the Supreme Court if Quebec could unilaterally declare independence, because that was, I guess, kind of Quebec's plan. Now, this is a very, very important case because it said has very important ramifications for Canadian constitutional law. So the Supreme Court said, no, Quebec could not declare independence unilaterally. That's just out of the question. But they added, however, if Quebec held a referendum on independence with a clear question on independence and a clear majority of people voted in favor of independence, then the federal government would be obligated to negotiate with Quebec over Quebec's independence. So with this decision, the decision was released in 1998. It's called the secession reference case, or formally I can't remember the exact formal title, but it's a secession reference case. If you look it up, that's what you'll find. It established a constitutional pathway in Canada for any province to become independent. Like, even though the decision itself refers to Quebec, the same constitutional law applies for every province. It's just recognized that way. And so a couple of years later, then in 2000, the federal government passed the Clarity Act, which kind of to put meat on the bones of that decision. Like, the Supreme Court, said a clear question and a clear majority. And so but they didn't, define those kinds of terms and some of the other other things. So the Clarity Act is legislation kind of to fill out some of the empty areas of that decision, it's supposed to be in compliance with the secession reference case, to give more details about the process a province would need to follow. And so that's there. Now, I just want to throw in a footnote to that, though. There's a lot of scholars in Quebec who think the Clarity Act is written tighter than it needs to be for the secession reference case. So generally, when I talk about independence and the pathway to independence, I like to talk about the secession reference case, because that's the constitutional law. And if there's any conflict between the constitutional law and the Clarity Act, the constitutional law would take precedence. So, because some people say to me, well, the Clarity Act, you got to go this, that, and the other thing, and it'll never happen. But if you read the secession reference case, even the judges, they contemplated, what if a federal government decided to just throw roadblocks in the way? Let's say a province votes for independence with a clear question and a clear majority, and the federal government just stonewalls. Well, they talk about some of these different possibilities, and how this would actually undermine the legitimacy of the federal government if they're not willing to follow Canada's constitutional law and follow the democratic decision-making process. So anyway, I just bring that up because when people say, well, they're never going to let us do this, even though that's law, there are other provisions there that if the federal government was to try and block the proper constitutional and legal process, they're opening up a can of worms, that won't necessarily help be in their favor. It could lead to independence through a different method, whether unilateral declaration of independence or something else. So I think there's the incentive for all of the players to follow the constitutional law process, because not following that process opens up a bigger can of worms and worse possibilities than following the process. So, but the most important point, I guess, to get back what you're saying, is that the Quebec referendums led ultimately to this Supreme Court decision, which created a pathway for each province, if they want to become independent from Canada.
Well, and I'm glad you gave some background regarding how that it is possible to change the Constitution, but there are, other than actually holding a referendum to separate or to leave Canada, I guess, that process to change the Constitution is important as well, because there are other policies and programs that are in place right now that are not beneficial necessarily to Alberta, like the equalization program, for instance, which requires constitutional amendment in order to change that. And so it's important to recognize as Canadians how difficult it is for Western Canada and Alberta in particular to gain any sort of change or foothold within the Canadian constitutional framework because of the barriers that are part of it. And I guess it makes sense that you obviously want a robust document in order to keep a nation together, but at the same time, there's been these lopsided agreements that are certainly, from an economic perspective, especially, are hurting Albertans. And so the fact that we don't have any leverage right now in order to convince the government and to change their policies and their agreements with Alberta so that we get a better deal, and it's something that is more fair and equitable, to use a progressive term, we're stuck in this holding pattern of really, begging for crumbs. It feels like most of the Alberta premiers, including Danielle Smith, have not been able to convince Ottawa and the powers there to really make any favorable policies or change the laws in favor of Western Canada and Alberta in particular. And with the Supreme Court of Canada, I mean, I think ultimately any attempts to want to separate or leave Canada will result in a court application to the Supreme Court of Canada. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that and how likely that would be that we would have a decision in favor of Alberta, given the political climate these days in Canada being, quite left, quite socialist and progressive. Progressive not in a good way, but in a way where this leftist socialist agenda has really taken hold, and that the Supreme Court of Canada itself has, in fact, boasted about how progressive they are in the world, the most progressive court in the world, and they're quite proud of it. So how likely do you see that actually bearing fruit for Alberta if it were to land in the Supreme Court of Canada?
You mean a challenge to an Alberta referendum kind of thing?
Yes.
Well,
Or equalization or yeah.
Yeah, well, like right now, like I don't have any hope in the court at all. I mean, we saw with the the carbon tax decision in 2021. There was a 6-3 decision against Alberta. Because Alberta's government had challenged Justin Trudeau's carbon tax. There was national carbon tax. So, but one of the judges who dissented was Russell Brown from Alberta, and like he's not on the court anymore, which is really bad because he was the best one there.
Yeah.
He explained how that carbon tax decision kind of reoriented Canada's constitution and transferred powers from the provinces to the federal government. That's the kind of court we have. So it was a bit of a surprise then, though, in October this past year when the Impact Assessment Act, which was challenged by Alberta, they backtracked a little bit. You know what I mean? That ruling was considered to have gone in Alberta's favor, even though the federal government hasn't really changed anything. I think the Supreme Court saw they'd gone too far with that carbon tax and were maybe backtracking a little bit. But overall, I don't think we're going to get much from the Supreme Court. And I think of this more in terms of the Alberta Sovereignty Act. The Alberta Sovereignty Act Alberta Sovereignty within the United Canada Act. Like some people say that's unconstitutional. And I mean, it depends on how it's used, right? But if that was to go to the Supreme Court, I don't think that's going to hold up. If there's something because the Supreme Court, there's 9 members of the Supreme Court, 7 are from Eastern Canada and 2 from the West. So it seems to be structured right from the beginning, against Western Canada, because you got 3 justices from Ontario, 3 from Quebec, and 2 from the Maritimes, and then 2 from the West. So it's structured that, at least from a geographical perspective, it's not favorable to Western Canada. But specifically, though, if let's say there was an independence referendum and that was challenged at the Supreme Court, I think it's a little bit different in the sense that it's the Supreme Court that opened the door to that with their secession reference decision, and that actually was a decision that was seen as kind of giving something to Quebec. Like it was very much in the context of Quebec's independence referendum and the aftermath. So it's written as specifically Quebec, and so I think this was seen kind of as a gift to Quebec that the Supreme Court kind of gave Quebec an out if they would follow the right rules. So I think if they were to kind of try and take that back, I think it would be seen as a slap in the face to Quebec, because any powers they would take away from, let's say Alberta had an independence referendum, anything that they would do to reduce Alberta's power to do that would also, by implication, reduce Quebec's power to do that. And I think they would be concerned about what the effect that would have in Quebec, how Quebecers would interpret that. So even though I think for the most part, the Supreme Court, I don't think they make good decisions. I'm not favorable towards them. Sometimes they're kind of put in places where they have to be more careful. And because the secession reference case is specifically a Supreme Court decision, and it was done, with the idea of giving something to Quebec, I think they're kind of in a corner with that one. So I don't think that they'd be able to, block. I don't think they'd be able to find an avenue to block a successful referendum in Alberta if the rules had properly been followed. Is that getting at the question you're asking, or?
Yeah. So what about the Danielle Smith Sovereignty Act, or I call it the Sovereignty Do Nothing Act, but what about it? Why are people saying that it's unconstitutional?
Yeah, well, I mean, it tends to be people on the left, I think, who say it's unconstitutional, because I mean, the purpose of it is for Alberta to exercise greater powers, and the Constitution sets out certain provincial powers. And so my understanding was, like, the Danielle Smith says, we're just exercising the powers we already have. So I don't see how that could be unconstitutional. But there, I guess maybe some people have talked about, well, I guess one of the authors of the Alberta Sovereignty Act originally, at least the idea, was Barry Cooper from the University of Calgary. And he has said openly he wants it to be unconstitutional as a way of provoking a constitutional crisis, because he thinks that constitutional crisis could be a way in which Alberta would be able to extend its powers or its jurisdiction or something in a way that benefit Alberta within the Constitution. But so until it's actually used, they can't really say it's unconstitutional until the Alberta government has actually done something that is unconstitutional. So it's all hypothetical.
So what would make it unconstitutional from your perspective?
Like if it actually, like, let's say the act claimed for the province a power that the Constitution explicitly gives to the federal government. Just trying to think of what that would, because it's generally speaking, the powers are, well, I guess actually, this is just kind of off the top of my head, but in the 1930s, when the Social Credit Party was elected, the Social Credit Party tried to institute monetary reforms that were in the federal jurisdiction, and so those policies were either struck down, like the federal government technically has a power called disallowance where they can strike down provincial laws. Now, it hasn't been used, I think, since the social credit period. So it's some people say it's kind of expired, but anyway, some of the social credit laws were disallowed. Some of them were struck down by courts because the monetary system is in the federal jurisdiction. And so if a province, say, tries to make its own money, that would be something that would be obviously transgressing on the federal responsibility. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
This is an old historical example, but I couldn't. It was the first one. It's the only one that came to mind where you did have a case where Alberta was, trying to implement certain monetary policies that are federal policies, and so they were struck down as unconstitutional. Obviously, right. That's not the kind of thing Danielle Smith's talking about, but it was it's the only actual example that came right to mind. That's for that.
Yeah, no, I think that's great, because I've often wondered, because from my perspective and reading of that act, I think it just delineates further the powers that already exist in Section 92 of the Constitution. One of the things that I've been critical of is the fact that she has stated that she will, if she ever does use it, and she hasn't used it yet, if she ever does use it, I will be interested to follow that, because I don't know if it will achieve anything, because she has said that she would honor whatever the Supreme Court decides, in that respect, which I guess makes sense, right? From obviously we're pushing back through lawful means, and we have laws for sure, but I don't know if that actually will advance Alberta's interests or not. So I guess more will be revealed as she continues on, and as we continue to get the squeeze by the Canadian government. But I see the Canadian government interfering and encroaching into provincial jurisdiction all the time. Housing, we're talking about healthcare, daycare, all of those things, and they seem to be getting away with it without too much pushback for right now anyway. But so I think your analysis of in your background with independence is so important, I think, because we do have a mechanism as Albertans to put leverage on Ottawa and the rest of the provinces in order to wake them up a little bit, and so I hope that our current government uses all of the tools available, including threatening or declaring that a referendum of independence will be held, because I think really at this state in time, I don't think that there are too many things that we can actually pull out of the magic hat in order to get in a better deal. But I want to get into your books, because I want to promote your books. They're really important. One of the books that we're not really going to talk about a lot today, but I think dovetails nicely with this, is a time the one, oh, it's just on the tip of my tongue, Leaving God Behind. I really loved that book.
Thank you.
And because as a Christian, trying to make sense of our Constitution, where it says, we are a nation that recognizes the supremacy of God and the rule of law. And lately, especially since Justin Trudeau Jr. has become prime minister, we've seen this stark difference, but it's actually been building. Christianity has actually been being eroded from Canadian law and Canadian culture, and is not any longer, I would say, a dominant worldview anymore in Canada. And we're certainly feeling the impacts and the results of morphing into certainly a secular society where there's absence of Christianity for sure, obviously religion because of the charter. And so I think that book is such an important book, and you make some really insightful points with respect to the dangers of the charter. So I do want to get into that, but I do want to, if we have some time, but I do want to talk about your book. So the first book was Alberta Separatism Then and Now. And I think for anybody who wants a really really good summary of the history of Alberta separatism, this would be the book to start with. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think so. Yeah, like I wrote that one. Like at the time I wrote it, there weren't any books on the history of Alberta separatism, and because because I'd been part of that during that time. Like when I did write it, I wrote it 2008, 2009. That's when it was published, 2009. At that time, Stephen Harper was prime minister, and there wasn't an independence movement or a separatist movement in Alberta for the most part. Yeah. I think there was there might have been the Separation Party, but it was very small, and there's very few people involved in that movement. And so the reason I wanted to write it, though, was in the course of researching other topics, I saw that there was a lot of this material on Alberta independence. Thank you.
There it is.
Thanks. That's great. So I thought there should be a history of Alberta separatist movement. Like I thought there should be one, and someone should write it, and it hadn't been written yet. And I thought, well, if I write it, at least it'll be written from the perspective of someone who was involved, like from the real perspective. I thought, like, if an academic was to write it, like a critic, they'd portray it as some kind of radical fringe thing. You know what I mean? And I wanted to portray it from how it was really perceived by those of us who were part of it. And so I use a lot of the original documentation from the organizations and from the sympathetic media, like Alberta Report, which was in publication essentially from 1973 to 2003. The Byfield family behind that were very sympathetic to Alberta independence. And so they covered it closely and they covered it sympathetically. And so that was kind of my primary source to cover that period, was from, Alberta Report and those, and also, like I say, the documents from the organizations involved. So I was able to present the history of the movement from the perspective of those who are involved, because there's a lot of good people involved. There was a good reason for that movement, and so if you read that, you'll see why people did get involved in that movement, how it started, and so you can understand it from the perspective of those who are involved. And one of the things, I guess, one of the compliments I've received from that book that are most encouraging to me is some people read that and go, I was there and I remember that. That's just how I remember it. I've had a number of people tell me that they remember living through it, and that's how they remember it too. So that makes me feel really good. And I think that's because I relied so much on the documentation of the time, the newspaper or the magazine articles of the time and the documents of the time. So you're actually reading, what was going on at the time. And so you get a real feel for what was happening.
Yeah.
So
and those kinds of things don't change. Like Wikipedia changes definitions, right? Like they're not fluid. And so your next book was No Other Option, Self-Determination for Alberta. And what was the difference? What different perspective, or what were you building on? You're building on independence, obviously, but what can readers expect with that one? I don't have a copy of that. I've lent that one out.
Sure. Well, that's basically an explanation of the case for Alberta independence. Like when Alberta Separatism Then and Now came out in 2009, there was literally no interest for it, and the publisher ended up pulling it because there was no interest. Anyway, when Justin Trudeau got elected in 2015, I convinced him to bring it back because there was going to be an audience for it with Trudeau in power. And sure enough, we did get a bit of interest in the book then. But then as interest grew in the Alberta independence movement and people saw that book, they'd say, well, this was written in 2009. We want something updated, that's that deals with contemporary things that have happened since then. And so rather than updating Alberta Separatism Then and Now, I did say to some of the people that asked me, I'll write something fresh and new that presents the case for Alberta independence, and I also have a chapter in there that kind of updates Alberta Separatism Then and Now. But essentially, No Other Option is an explanation as to why Alberta needs to become independent, and it also has a chapter where I talk a lot about the secession reference case. So I talk about how Alberta has been exploited and why we need to become independent. And I also talk in there about how Alberta is somewhat different culturally than the rest of Canada. I mean, not to the same degree that Quebec is different culturally, but there are reasons for arguing that Alberta is somewhat different from the rest of Canada. And when it's good to have that Alberta identity, it's good to know about that Alberta identity for people who want Alberta to become independent. So that's basically, but to summarize, it's just a book explaining why Alberta should become independent.
Cool. And now let's get to time to leave. I'm gonna just pull that up so everybody can take a look at this. Canada Cannot Be Fixed, and this can be found on Amazon. It's in Kindle edition right now, but it will be shortly, thinking about within the month, available in paper edition.
Hopefully in July. Like, I don't know for sure, but that's like the progress is being made. I've seen progress being made. I'm in contact with the publisher, so hopefully by sometime in July it'll be available in paper. And I know that people, I prefer paper for sure. I'm not an electronic book person myself, and so I'm really looking forward to having it in paper.
But so tell us about this, about what led you to write this book and how it might be different from the other ones.
Yeah, well, this one, like, it's a little bit similar to No Other Option in the sense it's an argument for independence. But what's different about this, like when I wrote No Other Option, I thought, well, here's a book promoting Alberta independence. I won't need to write about this anymore. But I found that people, generally speaking, like even Albertans that are upset with the federal government don't want to really leave. Even people who are sympathetic to independence in many respects don't want to leave. And so there's still
a very big... Why do you think that? Like, I've been kind of, is it the nostalgia of Canada? Is that what it is, do you think? Or what is it from your perspective why people are so resistant to that?
Yeah, probably there's some nostalgia, and there's just, like, generally speaking, I think the kind of people that support Alberta independence are more conservative minded people, and those tend to be the more patriotic people. You know what I mean? They're the people who have been historically cheering for Canada, and supporting Canada, in international conflicts or sporting or whatever. And so, like, I've been to like a separatist meeting where they sing "O Canada" at the beginning. You know what I mean? Because there's just this deep patriotic feeling for the country, and it's the people who support Alberta independence, like, are not naturally rebels against the federal government, if you know what I mean. They still have that love for Canada, but they're so offended by what's been going on. But so there's kind of this dichotomy within many people who want Alberta to be treated better, but they're still reluctant to leave Canada. And so I hear people tell me, well, even though they see the case for independence, we still need to try something else. We still need to try another reform or another government or something to make things better before we leave. And so I wrote Time to Leave because, as far as I can tell, when I look at the history, I think we've tried everything reasonable. We've elected conservative governments that are supposedly sympathetic to us. They haven't been able to fix the problem for us. In fact, Brian Mulroney, he was elected in 1984, and Albertans thought, well, this is going to solve the problem. And then 2 years later, in 1986 is when he awarded like a major contract for the C-15 fighter jet. It was supposed to be awarded to a Winnipeg company because Winnipeg won the contract, and he instead awards it to a Montreal company because he wanted the votes in Quebec. And so here, we even elected, here's a prime minister that the West helped elect and support, but he's still going to cater to Central Canada. That's kind of the example we get, when we elect. Conservative governments aren't always like that, but they're always bound to Central Canada. Anyway, that's just one of the examples I wanted to use. That we look back 40 years ago already. We're electing conservative governments to save us, and they haven't been able to fix the problem. If they could fix the problem, we wouldn't have the problem 40 years later. We're still fighting the same problem after all these years. So
I don't see it. Sorry to interrupt, Michael. I don't see anything actually being effective. And in fact, speaking about Brian Mulroney, I mean, he actually signed us onto the UN agenda. And so, I mean, I remember when I read this book, and thank you for asking me to read it, because I really enjoyed it. And I immediately after I finished it, I was like, okay, well, what about, how are we going to tie it in? What have you given any thought to this globalist agenda as another reason why we need to, as Alberta, leave Canada? Because remaining part of, and you had disclosed to me that it's kind of like a different research topic altogether, right?
Yeah,
And
that's right.
so, I mean, it is a huge topic, but from my perspective, these governments are actually have made agreements with other, with other provinces or globally that are actually turning out to be actually not in Canada's interests at all. And so, I mean, for Albertans, I mean, my pitch to Albertans is, in addition to all the troubles that we've had over the course of the last few decades trying to get a better deal within Canada and to change the constitution within Canada, and doing what we can, and trying to elect uh, conservatives who are more sympathetic to what Alberta is going through. Instead of, we've done all of that, and so really there is no other option but to get the heck out of Canada, and especially from the globalist perspective, because with the World Health Organization, they're entering into these treaties and the international health regulations, and what is happening is that Canadians' healthcare sovereignty, it will be and is being eroded to the point where we're going to have unelected bureaucrats making a minimum healthcare decisions for us, but worse, probably climate related decisions for us, because they've been able to whip the world into a frenzy of there being a climate crisis when there actually isn't a climate crisis, and CO2 is not a pollutant. However, that's not stopping these what I would call psychopath unelected bureaucrats making these crazy policies that they're going to expect their member nations and to follow suit. And Canada is part of the World Health Organization and all of that, and all the subsidiary organizations for the United Nations. And I see that threat to be right now the most imminent for Canadians and for Albertans, because we need to protect ourselves. If Canada is continuing to maintain a membership, and we know that the finance minister and deputy prime minister Chrystia Freeland is on the board of World Economic Forum, so she plays quite the prominent role there. That's not likely to occur, that Canada will wise up and stop funding and participating in this globalist organization that is damaging and will continue to damage economically and socially Albertans. So, I mean, I had to get that in because I'm really passionate about the threat that is upon us right now, that's imminent, that and even our provincial government, or AHS, has ties to the World Health Organization, and we're expecting what I think will be another pandemic being thrust upon us soon. And so I'm very concerned for Alberta, and at least declaring an intention to separate from Canada would be, I think, recognizing that it's going to take years for this to happen. I mean, years for this to happen. I mean, there has to be not only this intention, there has to be an education of the population of why and how and what would a new Alberta, an independent Alberta, look like. But it's also going to take time to negotiate. But without starting at the place of saying that Albertans are so frustrated that we want to seek out a referendum to separate, I don't see many options available left. So anyway, I took your airtime. Sorry about that, but Time to Leave is a summary then for anybody who's interested in this topic to realize, really, we have really nothing else up our sleeves that we can play right now that will change it.
Yeah, like it's to convince people that we don't need to try something else first, because we've tried so many things. Like we tried constitutional reform, like in the form of in Senate reform, Tripoli. So many people worked for so many years for Tripoli Senate, and it never happened. And we've been electing conservative governments, and even though the conservative governments are always better than liberal governments, like I don't want to make them the equivalent, because Stephen Harper was way better than Justin Trudeau, even though Stephen Harper had his problems as well. In fact, was just on this same topic is when Paul Martin was prime minister as a liberal, he created a panel to look into the equalization program. Then Stephen Harper was elected, and the panel reported after Stephen Harper was prime minister, recommending that Quebec be given more money. And Stephen Harper went along with that to give Quebec more money from the equalization program. And the reason he did that, of course, was because he wanted to win seats in Quebec. So here's a prime minister from the West who's personally pro-West, but he's still going to do what the system requires him to do if he wants to win. He has to cater to Quebec to win, right? So it doesn't matter how strong, how good of a Westerner would be prime minister. If he wants to be in power, he has to cater to Ontario and Quebec. That's the way the system works. And so that played itself out to some degree with Stephen Harper as well. Like he wasn't anti-West by any means. He didn't do anything to hurt us, but the things that he tried to do to help us, were not successful. And I guess that equalization thing, that just shows that the pressure is on regardless of somebody, what their intentions are. If they want to be in power, they've got to follow the pathway that leads to power, right, which is catering to Ontario and Quebec. Actually, if I can just jump in here with something going back to the Constitution, if that's okay. In terms of changes, like this is a point that Dr. Modry makes, and I think it's a valid point. Like it's different from my point. Like I want an independence referendum because I want Alberta to become its own country. But someone who didn't necessarily want Alberta to be its own country could still favor an independence referendum because it's the only way we'll ever get true constitutional negotiations. Like if Alberta has a referendum on independence with a clear question and a clear majority vote in favor of independence, that's not 100% guarantee that there'll be independence, but it's 100% guarantee there's going to be serious negotiations with the federal government, because I would expect a federal government facing Alberta on the verge of independence would have proposals, offering goodies to Alberta, trying to lure Alberta to stay within the country, if you know what I mean. And that would provide, for those who don't want to leave Canada, that would give them like genuine leverage with the federal government to try and make the country better, if you know what I mean. So a person like me, I want independence, so I support the referendum. But someone who doesn't necessarily want independence, they could also support the referendum, because that's the only way we'll actually get constitutional change. Like if you're going to advocate for constitutional change to benefit Alberta, you can go to Ottawa and you can talk to people till you're blue in the face. It's not going to happen because there's no leverage. But if Alberta had that successful independence referendum, then we could go to Ottawa and we can make demands. Like I say, I prefer the independence option, but other people will want to, take a look at what the federal government has to offer, and we theoretically could get some real constitutional changes then, and that's the only way, because there won't be any constitutional changes that benefit Alberta just from us talking or trying to convince the federal government that we want changes.
So one of the arguments that people throw out there is that as a nation, Alberta can never do it on its own because we're landlocked. We don't have access to tidewater. So can you let the listeners know that that's not an issue?
Yeah, like I don't think that's an issue, because there's a huge amount of goods, that go across from BC to Eastern Canada. Vancouver has this huge port. There's a whole bunch of materials that are imported in the Vancouver port, and then they go across Canada to I guess Ontario or wherever. Now, if Alberta was independent and the remaining provinces of Canada said, we're not going to allow you to ship your oil across our borders, we would also be able to cut off their shipments across our borders, because the trains and the roads that go from BC to Eastern Canada, we could just block those or put tariffs or whatever. We have leverage too. As an independent country, we'd have leverage. So it's very unlikely that would happen, because it's not in Canada's best interest to try and harm Alberta. If we were to become independent, it would be in their best interest to negotiate a positive economic settlement. If they cut us off and we cut them off, we're all hurt. We all lose. We'd all be taking a huge economic hit and be suffering. And it doesn't make sense. Like, it doesn't make sense to me that people in Ontario and BC would hurt themselves because they're so upset about Alberta becoming independent. You know what I mean? So I think the leverage is strong enough. The leverage is strong enough, and the incentive is strong enough to make a deal for us to allow their goods to go across our borders and our goods to go across their borders. That's the most reasonable thing. In a worst case scenario, though, we still have the United States because, the United States, I think, is the biggest importer of our oil. And they're still going to want our oil. Just because Alberta becomes independent, it doesn't mean like that the United States could cut off their oil supply from us, because that would put them in a shortage situation. So I just don't see a reasonable scenario where if Alberta follows Canada's constitutional law and becomes independent, it doesn't seem reasonable to me that people are going to boycott us or try and cut us off from the rest of the world. It doesn't make sense to me that would happen, because it's not like it hurts the other people as well as us. Like, why would someone hurt themselves just because they're angry at us? It doesn't make sense. People don't generally act that way, to hurt themselves financially because they're angry at someone. They might do that maybe for a few days or to their neighbor or something. But when you're talking about one of the biggest oil reserves in the entire world, why would they cut themselves off from that?
Yeah. So my next kind of topic is a little bit more, I don't know, controversial, and I don't even know if it's related, but we're in a state of right now where the worldview has shifted, right? You having a Canadian born here, I was actually born in British Columbia, but I've lived in Alberta since I was 5. And, Canada has always had its own kind of distinct identity, and Albertans have had a distinct identity within Canada as well. I see a massive shift happening. It's been happening for some decades, and it's because of this progression over to the progressive left and into wokeism, where there is kind of an inversion of truth and an inversion of morality and an inversion of God, actually, within our society. How do you see the worldview that seems to be captivating most of the institutions and our universities and our corporations? How do you see that influencing a push towards independence?
Oh, wow, that's a big question. I guess there's different ways of answering that. If I could just for background, like I'm totally in agreement with what you're saying. Like the Western countries and especially the English speaking countries like Canada, the United States, and Britain, we're based on a Christian worldview, for several generations, for centuries, literally. I mean, we got our legal system, like our freedoms come from that. Like, it's not a coincidence that the freest countries in the world, generally speaking, have been the English-speaking countries, Canada, the United States, Australia, and so on, because these were the countries that were influenced by Christianity. And one of the aspects of Christianity is that we have to have a limited government. Like, because every human being in the Christian worldview, every human being is sinful and and cannot be perfected in this life. And because of that, we know that anybody in government will have those same sinful tendencies. And so we want to limit government and have a division of powers in order that no particular individual gets the power over the rest of us. So that's kind of a fundamental worldview idea about the nature of human beings, that because we're sinful, we don't want any particular person to have a whole bunch of power. We don't want a group of people to have concentrated power. We want to have divided power and limited power. Now, if you, in the left-wing worldview, and I'm just being quite general, human beings are not sinful. Human beings are kind of like blank slates, and they're made good or bad by their society. And of course, when we look around society, we see that things, there's all kinds of bad people. So there must be something wrong with our society. It's making people bad. But the point being that the left-wing view thinks that it's society that makes people bad. And if we make society different, we can have a society where everybody's good. But how do you make society different? You have to fundamentally transform that society. And the only institution that can do that is the state. And so the left-wing view tends to view, rather than a limited state with divided powers, they want concentrated powers in a central state, especially if they can make it at an international level, because then there's less influence from the local people. But I bring that up because basically we've been transferring from one worldview to the other, from one worldview where we see the importance of limited government power to a worldview where we see the government as the one institution that can remake society in a way that's beneficial for everybody. That would be the left-wing view. And so kind of the progressive view, generally speaking, is we want to give more and more and more power to the government. And so our society has been moving in that direction. As we move away from Christianity, we move towards a society where the government is the only thing that can save us, in a sense. And so we want to give more power to the government so that they can make more decisions for our lives and make a better society that way. I might have drifted from what your question was originally, but
Well,
oh yeah, sorry.
no. I mean, I think you make some really, really good points. I mean, I think, I think we're in a constitutional crisis, first of all, for one, but I also think we're in a more broader, a broader time problem that we're having right now because of the shift in worldviews, and I think we're being regime changed fundamentally. They've dressed up and they've called communism, or corporate fascism, or whatever. It's a hybrid of kind of everything that they've been implementing within our society for decades now. Basically, spearheaded by the United Nations agenda, which was initially created to prevent the next world war. However, it's veered from its initial purpose substantially. And so, really, this worldview that society seems to be embracing is, it's like one big magic trick from my perspective, where people are being told, well, we're inclusive, we're diverse, and we believe in equity. And when you look at the roots of what those words mean and how they're being implemented, they're actually Marxist. In the genesis is Marxism, and you know communism, Marxism, neo-fascism, however you want to say it, but it is concentrating more power into the government. And looking, what I see now are, by and large, is that a big portion of our population looks to our government for decision making, even on the most minute things that affect their lives. And the number of rules that are made on a daily basis, at a municipal, provincial, federal level, all the regulations, we're in this massive nanny state. And I'm really quite, I'm not happy about it. I mean, one of the reasons why I created the Responsibility Quotient podcast was to talk about this notion of personal responsibility. And, in Christianity, one of the fundamental tenets of Christianity is free will, and giving that to individuals to make their own decisions. And I think by reclaiming personal responsibility in our lives, it actually makes us a better society, because it's one where we're held accountable, where there is justice, and where there are expectations that you as an individual need to level up, rather than relying on your government to sustain you. I mean, we're in a situation where the Canadian government routinely is talking about universal basic income and implementing another tax. And so we as citizens are at a stage right now where most people are happy with, or seem to be happy anyway, or maybe oblivious is the better word, to what the government is doing, in the problems that we are going to be in when we realize, and when society wakes up to the fact that government has basically replaced God in Canada, and government is now calling the shots, rather than the omnipotent God that we know is where we derive our inherent rights and individuality from. And so I I don't know what is going to happen in this world, in this province, but I think that what you're suggesting makes so much sense, um, for many reasons that we talked about today. But I think it's more urgent now than ever that we go down the path of separating ourselves from that worldview. And that I think it's about time that Albertans elect people who, we need to have a real serious conversation about values and morality and what kind of society we want to live in, and who is actually going to drive that. And I think it's going to be grassroots Albertans. And this information, recognizing that it's available, that it's a real solution, and something that Danielle Smith should be implementing and pushing right now, because, it is time to leave. It really is time to leave. It's time for a different approach to all of this. Michael, how can people follow you?
Well, like I'm on Facebook, just under my name. People who are interested in my books are available at a website called merchantship.ca. That's actually Merchantship is a small family business in Didsbury, Alberta. So it's, if you want to support a small business, it's called Merchantship. And so the website is just in lowercase merchantship.ca. And if you search my name there, my books will come up. That's the best way to get it. I do have a website. It's just kind of rudimentary. I think it's drmichaelwagner.com. Like one of my daughters runs that. Like it doesn't have a lot of stuff, but it's there. So those are the first things that come to mind if someone wanted to like take a look at my books. Or I guess I'm also on the Western Standard, like you mentioned. So if you go to the Western Standard and you look under columnists, I'm there. And you can click on the link and see the different columns I've written over the last few years. So those are different ways. Sorry.
Okay, so I just, before we end off today, I do want to put this question up, and I don't know if you can see it. Is there any truth to this comment from another discussion? Equalization payments come from general revenues. They do not come from individual provinces. General revenues come from taxes, not from individual provinces. Generations of Western conservatives have been lying to the easily led and cheaply bought cretins that keep them in power. What are your thoughts on that before we leave?
Well, like there's a sense in which that's right, but it doesn't make a difference. See, the point is that the federal government takes more money out of Alberta every year than it puts back, and it gives more money to Quebec than it takes out. So it doesn't matter whether it goes into general revenues or not. Like it's not like there's a specific payment. It's not like the Alberta government writes a check to Quebec or writes a check to the federal government. So that quote is sort of right, but it's misleading because it's trying to mislead people. There's a sense in which the Alberta revenues go into a general revenue thing, but every year Alberta is putting more in than it's getting out, and Quebec is getting more than it's receiving. So like in a superficial sense, that's correct. But the point is that Alberta is transferring money to Quebec, even if it's not, directly, from the Alberta government to Quebec government. It's not that. It does go through the federal government. It probably goes through the general revenues, like that person said, but it doesn't change the fact. The fact is that Alberta is putting the money in and Quebec's getting it. So whether you want to put it, as general revenues or whatever, it doesn't change the fact of what's actually happening. So I just kind of see that as technically true in a sense, but deceptive in what they're trying to accomplish with what they're saying.
Okay, cool. Well, we know how to get in touch with you, and any last words before we sign off for tonight?
Oh, I just want to thank you for having me on. It's always good to be here and to have these serious discussions with you.
Yeah, I really enjoy it too. And I hope you take to the audience, go out and get Time to Leave. I think Time to Leave Canada Cannot Be Fixed. Wise, insightful perspective in all three books. And I encourage you also to pick up Leaving God Behind as well, because Michael does a great job going through the destruction and the eradication of Christianity within Canada since the beginning of Canada, and I think that it provides actually a really good perspective for kind of what, another solution that we could all look to, which I really believe is ultimately the only solution, which is God. But that will provide a good context. It's a review of the case law, that significant case law that's altered the zeitgeist and social and moral fabric of our society, as well as it goes into the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and that the implementation of the charter wasn't it wasn't the bastion of freedom and rights that we were led to believe. And so maybe one day soon, Michael, we can have a conversation on that book alone, because I think right now in particular in our world, that conversation about religion and about Christianity and where this worldview has shifted to is actually the conversation that we need to have. In the meantime, your books are really insightful and important, and I encourage everybody to get them. And I wanted to thank you for making time for me tonight, and I hope we can do it again soon.
Yeah, that's great. And thank you
Thank
so much for telling people about the books too. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks.